joined as we are each month by attorney, author Chris Hand to help us make sense of government headlines. Good morning, Chris. How's it?
Good morning, Ann. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for being here. This was a epic city council meeting this week. 13 hours, start to finish, a little bit more. They ended up with a $2 billion budget. Um, both sides got something. Both sides lost something. I'm just curious, in all your years, if you've seen a budget meeting quite like this one.
I think this definitely sort of set a new tone for budget meetings. There have certainly been budget meetings that have gone very late before. There have been budget meetings that have been contentious on issues. I'm not sure there have been many that have combined those two factors in the way that this one did. As you say, it went 13 hours. They finally wrapped up the budget just before 4 a.m. On Wednesday morning after starting Tuesday afternoon. And really very narrow votes on some key issues. Ultimately, the city council passed the new millage rate or property tax rate by a single vote, a 10-9 vote. It decided to strip some controversial amendments out of the budget that were on policy issues, also by a single 10-9 vote. And out of those narrow votes came a more consensus vote for the overall budget, a 15-2 final vote. But it was contentious on a number of issues, and not just the substance, but also the rhetoric. There was some very heated rhetoric back and forth between members of the council. Remember, this is probably the most important thing that the city council does each year is pass a budget. Their number one responsibilities, their top responsibilities under the charter are to pass a millage rate. That's something that they have complete say over. The mayor has no role other than proposing a millage rate, and the budget, where the mayor has some line item veto authority. But again, the charter places that in council's scope of authority under our charter. So this is the most important thing council does each year. They typically tend to take this process very seriously, spend months on it going forward. So I think we saw that reflected in this meeting, very strong feelings about different aspects of both the city's revenue and expenditure picture. You add that with kind of a more difficult political climate right now. Plus the prospect of working 13 hours straight on anything into the wee hours of the morning. And I think that's why we saw some of the tone that we saw at that meeting the other
Yeah,
night.
some of it very personal. They really did seem to be sticking to their guns on both sides. It's surprising because the consequences of not passing a budget are really quite dire. I mean, that could affect city bond ratings. The state could take over city finances. And it seemed like it was almost a game of chicken until one of the city council members, Will Lanahan, basically said, he was willing to shift his vote on the DEI, abortion, and immigrant component, those amendments that were introduced by Rory Diamond. Ultimately, they decided not to impose those restrictions on the budget. Do you expect that issue is going to go away?
I don't think that issue is likely to go away because I think those amendments will probably continue coming up in some form or another. They'll try to attach them to different vehicles. I think one of the reasons Councilman Diamond was attempting to attach those amendments to the budget is that there would be a lower veto override standard. So essentially, when you pass legislation, you have to pass it by a supermajority, 13 council votes or more, in order to potentially override a mayoral veto. And we already saw that on one of these amendments earlier in the year. He had attached an amendment to something that would ban sort of funding for anything related to, undocumented immigrants, and the city spending funding on that. The mayor had vetoed it, and council did not have the 13 votes to override. So his strategy here was to put those in the budget because when a mayor vetoes line items in a budget, council only needs a simple majority, 10 votes, to override that veto. So that was the strategy here. But no, I don't think we've heard the last of those amendments. I think that he will probably attempt to find other vehicles for those, and there'll be further discussion about them going forward. Obviously, they initially did pass. This was for people who like to follow legislative process, which is probably virtually nobody at this point, but for people who like to do that, it really was sort of a game of legislative twister because in the sense of those amendments initially passed 10-9. So you think, well, that's a council majority. Now the budget will go ahead and pass 10-9 as well, right? No, because there are two members of the city council, Mike Gay and Terrence Freeman, who are associated with companies who have contracts or get money from the city. So a ruling was made that they had to recuse themselves from the final budget vote. That meant that that 10-9 majority didn't exist for the final budget. There were only 8 votes for that.
So they could vote on the amendment, but they couldn't vote on the budget.
Couldn't vote on the budget, exactly. So as a result, there was not a majority for the budget. And as you said, there are very dire consequences. The city gets almost $250 million a year in shared state funding each year that could potentially go away if the budget were not passed in time. As you say, the state would actually have more authority at that point to do a fiscal takeover, which, kind of given what's happening with Florida Doge and some of those efforts right now, is not just sort of a hypothetical situation. And as you say, the city's bond rating could be affected, which impacts and makes it much more expensive for the city to borrow money, which it's doing right now for a lot of infrastructure projects, including the renovation of the stadium. So there were dire consequences until, again, just before 4 a.m., Will Lanen, who's the city council person representing District 3, who had voted for the amendments, he essentially said, look, our most important job as council members is to pass this budget. We need to get this done. So he changed his vote on the amendments of the budget. The amendments would be taken out of the budget, and the budget itself would ultimately pass.
It's interesting when, you say that it is the most important thing that the council does. I think there were council members saying that themselves. So it is interesting that there are 2 council members that are prohibited from voting on the budget at all. But that vote you mentioned, Will Lanen, said, he had a great line where he said, at some point you have to be pragmatic, and you start thinking real pragmatically at 3:30 in the morning. It was a late meeting. We're talking to Chris Hand. He is an attorney, author, and government expert about the latest headlines on the state and local level. If you've got questions or comments for Chris, you can give us a call at 904-549-2937 or email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. We've got Mark from the South Side on the line. Good morning, Mark. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. I was just curious, and I haven't paid a lot of attention to it since it passed, but I don't know if the millage rate issue passed or failed. But my whole concern prior to this was the city council. It seems that the budget for the city, if I heard correctly, has grown significantly over the past 3 or 4 years. I mean, way past, inflation, all that stuff. It's grown. And we're worried about a $14 million property tax cut out of a $2 billion city budget. That's less than 0.7%. And so I look at that number and I think that's nothing. So if I'm on the right, pushing a tax cut, about all, to me it seems more symbolism over substance. Yes, you pass the tax cut, but it isn't anything significant in my opinion. And if you're on the left, I would say, yeah, let them have that tax cut. It isn't anything. Why would we even argue on it? But again, I don't even know if the thing passed or not. That was just my comment.
Thanks, Mark. And it did pass the millage rate reduction, 1/8 of a mill. There was pressure from the state CFO to have a much bigger cut, something that perhaps Mark would support. And we do know that, we're going to get to the issue of property taxes and their future in Florida, entirely. But property taxes have risen by more than 45% since 2019. That is a huge chunk of money that governments are getting, local governments are collecting. And so, I mean, I would guess inflation, answers some of the why they would be spending that much more money. Is that the full answer?
I think that's part of the answer. So, Mark, to your question, as Ann just said, yes, the millage rate with the reduction did pass. So now our millage rate is 11.19, or that's essentially $11.19 per $1,000 of property value is the new millage rate. That's a cut of about 1/8 of a mil, about 1% of property taxes. I think the average homeowner, will see, just about $20 in savings over the next year. That'll also be about $13.5 million that had to be cut from the city budget. And there's no question that property tax collections have gone up as home values have increased in this state, which they have substantially. And of course, commercial property values, any property values, as they've gone up, that's had a big impact. I think what you've seen, and people who had argued against the millage decrease would say that the cost of many government services have also gone up considerably as well, whether that's the cost of salaries to kind of government employees have increased again with inflation and price rises. The cost to build things for government has gone up. And so even though property tax collections have been up, I think those who opposed the millage reduction would say that, that government costs have gone up as well. And property taxes, we'll talk about this more, I'm sure, we get into what Tallahassee's doing, but do tend to fund a lot of these core services like police, fire, parks, public works, in case of school boards, teacher salaries. So they do fund a lot of core services. But, Mark's position was the one that ultimately prevailed at city council, where they did make this property tax reduction, $13.5 million. Council was able to restore, despite that reduction, some items that had been cut out of the budget. So money for affordable housing, money to finance the city's kind of annual dues to the Northeast Regional Council, which is our regional planning council here, money for some community health clinics. So I think what you really saw on Tuesday night was kind of a back and forth that ultimately ended in a balance. Folks who wanted to reduce the millage, who have some of the same concerns that Mark does, were successful in doing that by 1/8 of a mil. But some key city priorities that I think others were concerned might be threatened by that millage cut were put back into the budget. That's the kind of balance and back and forth you often see in budget negotiations, and you often see right there on budget night. This year was no different.
We've got a call from Tom on the west side. Good morning, Tom. Go ahead.
Yes. I got to say, the most interesting part of both of the budget discussions, and the second one was way less contentious than the first, was how the Diamond Amendment really fractured the Republican voting bloc. Also, yeah, the millage thing. Let me quickly add this. The overwhelming mood of the commentators during the night was, oh my gosh, yeah, we don't want this. So it's very disappointing that they went and passed this insignificant reduction for the average homeowner.
Thanks, Tom. I asked our Jacksonville Today City Hall reporter, Mike Mendenhall, about the split because there was many dozen speaker cards, well over 50. I don't know the final count, but I was asking him how it sort of shook out. And he said it was about 60-40, he thought, in terms of people who were supporting a millage rate cut versus people who were supporting services and opposing some of those cuts. But certainly the Diamond Amendment was incredibly divisive, and at one point, Diamond really thought that he had won. I mean, he said, he criticized, quote, the tyranny of the minority who were going to refuse to accept that you lost the vote. He said, you lost. Lose the vote with some grace. Don't hold up the entire city budget. So I think he really thought that this was going to go his way.
Well, and as we've talked about, it ultimately did not, because you have to, a budget is the whole of the sum of its parts, and you ultimately have to pass kind of an ultimate budget. So it was not successful. First of all, on the issue, I just want to compliment everybody who showed up, every citizen who showed up at City Council, regardless of what position they had, to make their position known to council members. The top of the organizational chart at the city of Jacksonville is the citizenry, and this is the citizens' budget. So to everybody who took time out of their schedules on Tuesday night or early Wednesday morning to be there and voice their opinions, kudos to you for using your effective citizenship powers to make your position known. The Diamond Amendments were very controversial. We heard this during some of the public comment, and I think they were controversial for a number of reasons. One is more substantive. There are people on different sides of this issue, and obviously there were citizens there and around the community who feel like who disagree with Councilman Diamond's positions on those issues. But there's a procedural issue as well that I think caused some controversy among the council members. For decades, it has been an article of faith among the council that budget should be statements of revenue and expenditures, that they should not include anything organizationally or operational or policy in a particular budget. This was a sharp contrast from that there are these three essentially policy statements in a budget. That's more common at the state and federal level, where there's what's called proviso language, where the legislature or Congress puts in language to kind of provide context to some of their spending decisions. But here at the local level, that's typically not the case. A budget records revenue in and directs expenditures out. So procedurally, I think this caused some consternation among council members as well, because, again, it's been an article of faith for council for decades that is not the case. When I was at City Hall, particularly in our first budget, we had some things in it. The council said, nope, we don't do reorganization or policy in a budget. We're taking those out in our process. And I think, again, both substantively and procedurally, that's why this was controversial. And I think, ultimately maybe one of the reasons this didn't pass.
All right. We've got a call from Mike in Riverside. Good morning, Mike. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks for walking us through this contentious meeting. I had to go to bed a little after 1 a.m. because I had work the next day. But I was curious, could you talk a little bit more about, with all of the debate over the line item amendments and restoring some of the funding? I know there was discussion around, was it going to come from, say, for the community health services, was it going to come from UF? No, it would come from fund balance. It would come from budget stabilization. With the millage cut, where is the money going to be coming from for the restoration of some of these programs?
Thanks, Mike. I mean, one thing that I can tell you is there is going to be a way more detailed look at that in Jacksonville today. I mentioned Mike Mendenhall was there for the entire meeting, and he is drilling down on that today. So there will be a greater understanding of that. And I don't know that I have that level of understanding myself.
There was some debate, and so they ended up pulling it from a variety of sources, whether that's budget stabilization or fund balance, which is another way of saying one of the city's reserves. They ended up, I think, and we'll see some of the more detail when Mike and others kind of unpack that. By the way, kudos to Mike Mendenhall from Jacksonville Today and other reporters, David Barreline from the Florida Times Union, A.G. Gankarski from Florida Politics, folks from all the TV stations who were there until the bitter end and covered every aspect of this. But right at the end, as they were doing some of those restorations for affordable housing, community health clinics, the Northeast Florida Regional Council, the council worked with the auditors to identify a variety of different funding sources, some of which, our caller just sort of named, avoided kind of cutting into things like UF Health and the amount that the city gives to UF Health Jacksonville. I suspect there's going to be a lot of truing up in the days to come. One of the things the council did with some funding was do what's called put it below the line. In other words, kind of delay it for kind of, stick it in the budget as a possibility, but delay the actual passage. One example of that is each year the city of Jacksonville has given money to Jack's Chamber. That was put below the line in this budget for future consideration. So my anticipation is that council and the council auditors are going to have to come back to a variety of these items just to ultimately true them up. That's very common in this process. And, council deals with budget issues every 2 weeks in their meetings, even if they are not passage of the big budget. So it's not uncommon to have to go back and make some tweaks and take some other action to make sure that everything is properly aligned.
All right. We're talking to Chris Hand about the latest state and government headlines, state and local headlines. You can give us a call at 904-549-2937 to join the conversation. I want to move on to some of the ongoing fallout, particularly on the free speech front when it comes to Charlie Kirk and, following the assassination of, this fairly disputatious podcaster and activist. A lot of people getting suspended, a lot of people losing their jobs or perhaps about to lose their jobs. I saw one report that said there's been around 100 people nationwide, including police officers, teachers, nurses that have been either suspended or fired. And we know that, even our own colleague here, A.G. Gankarski, was briefly suspended from his news outlet for a question that he asked of a congressman in the wake of in the immediate aftermath of the assassination. So a lot of people wondering about the chilling impact on freedom of speech.
Well, first of all, a horrible tragedy, and not just a tragedy, but, a crime in the assassination of Mr. Kirk, and, condolences to his wife and to his children and family on that killing. And as you say, Ann, it has, kind of launched a national conversation, not just about Mr. Kirk and, that horrible act, but also about some of the free speech implications of that. I thought it was very powerful at his funeral that Erica Kirk, his wife, in giving, her kind of, eulogy to him, talked about sort of that, that she forgave the person who shot him, and that, the way that he would want to deal with this situation and the way she planned to was not with hate and not with love. And so I think those were powerful sentiments that were said at his funeral. We have not necessarily seen those sentiments kind of translate to kind of other parts of the dialogue since then. I think as you say, there have been some suspensions of media figures, probably most prominently Jimmy Kimmel, who has a late night show on ABC, Um, I think where the challenge gets in on free speech, of course, is when sort of government actors get involved. All right, the First Amendment protects freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and that doesn't mean people can't disagree and that people aren't going to be held accountable or there won't be consequences from things we say. I think there's a real distinction at times between understanding the difference between you can say something and there might be negative consequences for you in that, or you might be held accountable for it. But when we get into constitutional issues is when the government begins to regulate that speech and take punitive action related to that speech. And I think that's been one of the biggest concerns nationally and in the aftermath of this horrible act. For example, the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission appeared to threaten media affiliates that aired, Jimmy Kimmel's show after some remarks that he made, which he's clarified to say that in no way was he trying to make light of Mr. Kirk's death. But when the chairman of that commission, a commission that approves kind of media transactions and otherwise regulates kind of local affiliates around the country, when the chairman essentially, indicates that punitive action might be taken against stations that don't remove someone from the air because of a comment they've made, that's when you begin to get into these government regulation of speech issues. Similarly, there was a controversy involving a city commissioner from kind of South Florida who made some unfortunate and inappropriate comments online. And, of course, that person's constituents have the power to remove that person from office. But again, getting into the realm of government action, there then began to be calls from some to have the governor suspend or remove that person from office. So, again, people can disagree about comments and, things we say and do. We can be held accountable for those, and there can be consequences from them. But when you really begin to get into these deep First Amendment concerns, is when government actors begin to indicate they are going to take action based on that. And I think that's been some of the concern about the aftermath of this horrible assassination, where government actors have weighed in.
So you mentioned the Palmetto Bay Councilmember Steve Cody, who had made, as you said, very, kind of tasteless remarks about Charlie Kirk and his murder. But the participation now of two congressmen who are urging the governor to have him removed from office, basically citing, and I'll quote the letter that they sent to Ron DeSantis, saying that, he's used previously his power, quote, to suspend local officials whose actions or behavior undermined the confidence Floridians have in their government, and saying that removal, in this case, such decisive action is necessary. Undermining the confidence Floridians have in their government. Is there anything in there that is a foothold for sidestepping or avoiding the freedoms afforded by the First Amendment?
Well, the governor has very broad suspension powers, as we've seen over the last couple of years, and that he's suspended state attorneys in both Hillsborough County and Orange County, and in some other circumstances as well. That power is broad, but I think one would be hard pressed to interpret that power as the power to suspend someone sort of based on what they've said. I think it's important to remember that in our democracy, there's an ultimate suspension power that belongs to the electorate, to the voters. So if this particular city commissioner is going to be running for office again, he's going to be held accountable for these remarks, and voters will make the decision whether or not, these, as you say, very tasteless, unfortunate, inappropriate remarks should have a bearing on whether this person continues to stay in office or not. But if you interpret the governor's suspension power to include any situation where somebody says something, again, I think that's really going to invoke these serious First Amendment concerns about government control and government trying to sort of directly regulate speech. In our democracy, citizens have the ultimate suspension power, and whether it's this city commissioner or any other elected official, that's ultimately where they're going to be held accountable for what they say and do at the ballot box.
I want to move on and ask you about the pending sale, the efforts to sell the Duval County School Board headquarters. There was new reporting this week, again, from our colleagues at Jacksonville Today. Megan Malicote did some excellent deep dive reporting into other bids that were received. So we had heard about this $20 million bid. Fleet Landing wants to buy the old school board headquarters downtown that's on the river, turn it into a senior living facility. That was presented to the school board. None of the other offers were presented to the school board. And in fact, Megan's requests, repeated requests for those other offers were denied, the school district citing a statute that did not apply as an exemption to the public records law. She ultimately got those records, and it showed that there were these other bids. First of all, just I want to ask you straight up about the transparency element there. There is an expectation that government records, government functions are public. But it's sort of one thing to not tell the media, I suppose, about pending offers, to not tell the school board itself, which did not get this information, at least as of when the report was written in Jacksonville today. What is an obligation to turn over that kind of information to them so they know who else is bidding, how much they've offered?
Well, I think it's crucial they have the school board members are fiduciaries, just like sort of members of any organization who have an obligation to make financial decisions on behalf of Duval County Public Schools. They set budgets, they make policy decisions, they have that fiduciary obligation to the school system. So I think anyone would argue that it's critical they have key information to be able to sort of make those decisions. First of all, kudos to Megan, who, on a variety of educational issues, not just this one, has been very persistent and dogged in her reporting, trying to get information. I think it's important information so that the public is also aware of kind of the financial decisions the school board is making. This is a very significant financial decision for the school board. They are moving from a headquarters they've had for the last now almost 45 years, or potentially moving, depending on what the board decides, to a new facility, one that's kind of located in the south side. And these are significant transactions. Again, they're going to gain somewhere between $17 and $20 million for the sale of their current building, and then pay out somewhere in the neighborhood of about $14 million for this new building in the south side. These are significant amounts of taxpayer money. So I think it's incumbent always on public agencies to make sure not only that their fiduciaries, these school board members, have the key information they need to make those decisions, but the public, through the media and other sources, have this information as well so that they can weigh in, just like citizens did at City Council the other night, with their opinion as to whether or not this is the right move for the school board or not. Because again, just like with the city of Jacksonville, the Duval County School Board, the top of the organizational chart is citizens who pay the taxes and ultimately hold elected officials accountable.
And it's worth noting that the school board was scheduled to vote on moving ahead with this sale as pitched to them before any of this information became available a couple weeks ago. They delayed that vote, and we'll see kind of where it goes from here now that they have this information.
Well, and kudos, and there's multiple school board members who are asking a lot of good questions about this transaction. I think 5 of the 7 have had questions about some of the real estate commissions the school board might be paying here, some of the other aspects of the deal. In other words, the deal would, if they took the $20 million offer, there would be $12.5 million the school board would receive now, and then another chunk of that would be several years later. And school board members have expressed, why are we doing that if there is an interest attached to it? So they're asking very good questions, doing exactly the kind of due diligence they should be doing. But that's always much easier when you have the information you
when
need
you have
to,
the
yeah,
information,
exactly.
right? Exactly. Well, I do want to ask as well about property taxes. The legislative session doesn't begin until January 2026, but the House is already meeting, discussing whether there should be a constitutional amendment put on the ballot for voters to decide whether they want to abolish property taxes in Florida, which sounds like a great idea, right? Everybody's like, yeah, I don't want to pay property taxes. The governor calls them I think he calls it a fee a rental fee or something. I'm sorry, I can't remember the language he has. But at any rate, they're looking at this constitutional amendment. Property taxes make up a big chunk of revenue for a lot of counties, not for all counties. Where do you see this going in terms of who might be impacted? We know that they're looking at possibly for people who have homestead properties, possibly for everybody that owns property.
Well, I think it's to be determined. The House appointed a special committee on property taxes, which is a huge committee. There are 120 members in the Florida House of Representatives. There are 37 of those members who are on this House Committee on Property Taxes. So And they kind of started their work this week, kind of hearing from a variety of finance officials to really understand how ad valorem or property taxes work in this state, have begun hearing from local officials as well. It's not clear ultimately what the constitutional amendment would be. As you say, the kind of most aggressive form of that would be abolishing property taxes altogether. And by the way, this does have to be a constitutional amendment that would require 60% plus one of the voters to approve because property taxes are enshrined in the Florida Constitution. The most aggressive version would be abolishing them altogether. Kind of the middle version would be abolishing them on homestead properties, properties that we've declared to be, actually where we live. And there would be smaller versions as well. The governor at one point floated an idea of having a $1,000 rebate for kind of property tax owners. So it's not clear where this is going to land. What is clear is that any change in property taxes has a very significant impact, particularly on local governments. So city government, county government, school boards. Just for example, school boards around the state, school districts collectively get 47% of their funding from property taxes, 53% from the state. So you think of all the things that a school district funds, things like teachers' salaries, building maintenance, everything else that go into, buying instructional materials, everything that goes into running a school district. Essentially, half of that money comes from property taxes. The Florida Policy Institute's done some analysis on what some of this might mean in local communities. Let's just take the city of Jacksonville. We just passed a roughly $2 billion budget. 1.2 billion of that $2 billion budget is funded through property taxes. So if you were to say eliminate property taxes altogether, you've now eliminated more than 50% of the city of Jacksonville budget, a budget that funds core services like police, fire, parks, public works, matters like that. If you just eliminated property taxes on homestead property, that would cut $400 million out of that nearly $2 billion budget. So that's a fifth of the budget right there, again, which primarily funds most of that budget is funding some of these core services that we're talking about.
Sure. I mean, half of it goes to public safety.
Exactly right. If you just go a little bit to the south in St. Johns County, you cut all property taxes out. That's nearly $400 million of their budget right there. And if you just cut out the homestead, that's just slightly over $200 million. And you see numbers like that throughout the state. This is something that local governments heavily rely on for those core services like police, fire, parks, public works. And so there's great consternation at the local level about what the state legislature might do. It's not clear where the legislature is going to take this. It is going to be a very contentious issue in the 2026 legislative session, which, because it is an even-numbered year, starts in January this year and will end in March. So really, for the first quarter of the year, expect that session to be dominated by talk of property taxes, and then the arena will shift to the ballot, because whatever they pass, which has to be passed by a supermajority in the legislature, would then go on the November ballot. 60% plus one of the Florida electorate would have to decide to make whatever property tax change they recommend.
In just about a minute that we've got left, I want to talk about the gubernatorial race and how that's lining up, because we know that there's a couple of names that appear to be on the precipice of declaring, including possibly the lieutenant governor, Jay Collins, and also Orange County Mayor Jerry Demings from the Democratic side. So there are people that are suggesting that they might be tossing their hat into the ring. How does that what is that whole race looking like so far?
Well, it's beginning to be a very crowded field. On the Republican side, you've already had declared Congressman Byron Donalds from Southwest Florida has been endorsed by President Trump. Former House Speaker Paul Renner, who is from this area, has also joined the governor's race. And now the Lieutenant Governor, Jay Collins, who's sort of seen as the candidate most likely to have Governor DeSantis' support, has also entered the race. So now an increasingly crowded Republican primary. On the Democratic side, you have former Congressman David Jolly, former Republican, now Democrat, who's running. And as you say, Orange County Mayor, formerly Orange County Sheriff Jerry Demings, has indicated he may jump into the race as well. You've seen other names like former Congressman Al Lawson and others. So it's beginning to feel like an open governor's race again. In 2018, there were a number of candidates who ran after Rick Scott was termed out of office. Ron DeSantis ultimately won. But now, 2020, 6 is beginning to feel like 2018 again with a number of candidates. We'll have to see over the next couple of months how this develops and who the final candidates are. But we do know now it appears we're going to have robust primaries both on the Republican and the Democratic side.
Yeah, and probably rekindling the Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, rift there if we've got two very strong candidates endorsed by either man.
No doubt.
So, well, Chris Hand, it is always great to talk to you every month. Thank you for being here today. Really appreciate it.
And I'll look forward to seeing you in October.